Hello, and thanks so much for joining us for this two-part discussion on the election of 2024. Black voters could play an important role in determining the outcome of this election. So what's at stake? I'm Carol Jenkins, and this is Black America. And joining me are three experts to guide us through the possibilities. Dr. Basil Smikle, political strategist, director of the public policy program of the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. Dr. Christina Greer, associate professor at Fordham University, author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, and host of the Blackest question on the Grio Black podcast. And Errol Lewis, host of New York One's Inside City Hall and The Big Deal with Errol Lewis, and he is a big deal, that you can watch every Friday. Errol is also an adjunct professor of urban reporting at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. And thank you all so much. I am happy to say that you all are friends as well as experts, major experts. And I want to thank you because I get to see you every single day on some major network telling the nation what's actually going on, you know, from your terrific perspective. So I want you to know that those of us sitting at home in our living rooms yelling most of the time, you know, get to at least smile when we see you come on and give a rational explanation for whatever. So I'd like each of you to start us off in where you think we are. And as we do this broadcast, it's March 20th. As we're recording, 7 months before the actual November 5th election. So 7 months to go. Basil, we'll start with you. Okay. Where are we?
Well, you know, I was on one of those major networks just yesterday where there was a conversation about these terrible numbers for Joe Biden, that black voters were just not enthused and not going to turn out, and should the administration be worried and concerned. And I've been saying time and time again that one of the things that those numbers reflect is this narrative that we have to decide between the lesser of two evils. And part of my challenge is trying to explain to folks that the lesser of two evils got us Donald Trump in 2016. Because A, people didn't want to come out. B, I think there was a tamp down of African American votes literally because of a lot of that narrative. And this is happening in light of so much evidence to the contrary. I don't think a lot of black voters are going to vote for Donald Trump, but if you even have that inclination, just consider the fact that the RNC has done away with their minority outreach. That includes veterans, by the way, done away with that.
They're closing down a lot of what they consider to be excess things, right?
It's excess, right? Even though these are votes that Republicans believe that they can get.
Right.
But they're closing down that shop.
Right.
Consider that the Brennan Center for Justice had this great study that said that the gap between white and non-white voters is actually expanding, and that is occurring particularly in places where the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Now, to me, that suggests that conservatives are on a mission to not only reduce African American voting power, but do away with any need to engage African Americans just broadly on a host of other issues. So I would say that the evidence is clear that it isn't a lesser of two evils, that there is a very clear choice, and I would say that choice is Joe Biden and Democrats, because even if you say that there's something about Joe Biden you don't like, maybe think about this as a parliamentary election of sorts. What is the agenda that you get from one party versus another? If you don't want to vote for Joe Biden, vote for Keith Jeffries, vote for Kamala Harris, vote for all the folks that I think are more about expanding our opportunity rather than restricting.
I love your rationality, Basil. You know, and that's we'll come back. We'll come back to you, but Errol.
I think there's a lot on the agenda. There's a lot at stake, and we're going to see a lot of coverage. And we all know how this goes. The coverage will mostly focus on strategy and tactics and which group is being appealed to and so forth. But I would want to start with the stakes, that there's a lot at stake. Democracy is at stake. Voting rights are at stake. basic prosperity, access to higher education, access to opportunity, health issues are the stakes. And to that extent, that discussion is really underdeveloped, I think. I don't know if we've had enough of that, and that's how I read a lot of those numbers. When you see some of these poll numbers suggesting that Donald Trump is going to get a higher percentage of the black vote than anyone since Dwight Eisenhower, first of all, I suspect that that's not going to happen. It's not going to play out. But the fact that it's even anywhere in that direction suggests that people in the leadership have not adequately mobilized and informed the rest of the community. And I, have spent many, many years doing this and have seen that there's a relatively small tier of people who are up on the facts, command a lot of respect, have networks that are serious networks by which they convey the stakes, the information, the urgency to the rest of the community. That group has not yet been activated. And I think when it does, the numbers will start to change, the contours of the race will become clear, the stakes will get to be known by more in the community, and then the race will really start. As of right now, I think it's early days, and so you start to see some of these odd numbers, like, Donald Trump somehow being more popular among black voters than, say, George Bush. We're talking about the difference between, 8.5 and 9.5 out of every 10 black voters voting Democratic, but that number can make a difference because we saw and we know where the swing states are.
Precisely.
It makes a big difference in, Ohio and Wisconsin and Georgia. So those are some things for us to all be aware of, and people should be aware that there's a lot of work to be done. It's not just a matter of registering a handful of people and making sure you show up on election day. There's a lot more work to be done.
Everybody's nodding their heads. Christina.
Yeah, I mean, there's a deeper conversation that probably needs to happen. It seems as though this particular election, there's a real sense of ire and disdain from black voters towards the party, towards Joe Biden, and we'll see if those numbers really bear out on November 5th. One of the issues that we have to contend with is the growing misinformation and disinformation that seems to permeate our communities, and the cost of access to real journalism gets more and more expensive. So sometimes you're on a network where you actually have to have a cable package to actually hear intelligent people talk about ideas, right? But there are other networks that are free, and you can just kind of get, or newspapers or websites that are free, and that's where a lot of misinformation and disinformation occurs. We also know it's pretty early. We have been talking about this. We are highly activated, but the average voter doesn't get interested really until late October, which is very, very, very late for me as a political scientist. But
that's pretty scary.
It's very
late
scary,
October.
But this is real. And then also, this is a larger Democratic problem. We saw it with the presidency of Barack Obama. Democrats have a lot of successes rebuilding the social safety net. They just don't articulate their wins. So then you get this lazy analysis of, well, both parties are the same. It's the lesser of two evils. I don't see the difference between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. There are massive differences, but all of the successes of Joe Biden, he's essentially hiding his light under a bushel, not utilizing the vice president in a lot of ways, not going out, to the bully pulpit consistently saying, this is what I've done. So when you think about, folks are like, well, we keep finding billions of dollars under the couch cushions for international affairs, but what about my community? What about my schools? What about, my lack of, sustainable housing, whatever it may be? It's like, well, we can think about the successes of the Biden administration, whether it is infrastructure or climate change or education funding or nutrition even, but who knows that? So if it happens in a vacuum, why is anyone motivated to turn out? And so I think there is a lot of work to be done on multiple levels, as Basil and Errol have laid out. Time is of the essence, and we'll see if Democrats can essentially go in the trend of the nation when we think about marriage equity, a woman's right to choose, and all these issues.
But don't you all agree that infrastructure is a hard sell? I mean, I don't. Maybe you don't,
I'm an urbanist. I'm the wrong person to ask. But I mean, how many people commute to work every day?
Yeah.
I know, but they need you to put people. This is how it affects people. The infrastructure. Even though we know, just tremendous work is very hard to grasp? What does that have to do with me?
You know, it's interesting because I had the pleasure of hosting Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg at Hunter.
I saw that, right?
Last semester. You know, he makes the point that the problem with infrastructure is that it takes a long time to build things.
Right, not
And
only
so-
that, but right.
And so it's a lot, there's a lot of money at stake, but
Right.
it takes a long time. But one of the things that if you're looking for signs of more of that conversation, as was said before about what the administration is doing, they've now started to task the cabinet members with going out and talking about their successes and wins. So if you have Pete Buttigieg, who appeals to a lot of voters in a lot of different demographics, particularly young voters, talking about how Black businesses can get involved in some of the contracting with these infrastructure projects, like things like that
Right.
actually become meaningful over time. The problem is, again, they just take a long time to build.
Right. The runway is very long.
That's right, and the explanation has to be there. There's something, you know, my academic friends know that's called rational ignorance. You know, and like I don't know how my car actually works. I can change a tire. If you put a gun to my head, I could probably change the oil. Everything else, I don't know, and I don't need to know. I don't need to know. I got other stuff to worry about. That's how most people are about politics. They got other things. They want to get sneakers for their kid for the summer. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their parents. You know, they're fighting with a lot of different day-to-day struggles, and they're relying on the rest of us to sort of come to them with the information so that instead of saying infrastructure, we say, you know, there's 10,000 new apprenticeships in the Steelworkers Union in, you know, Milwaukee or wherever, and that's why we want to support what the president is doing, for example.
Right.
That's
Christina,
the kind of
urbanist.
conversation we need.
There's your assignment, Christina. You've
Well,
got 7 months.
Yes, and we also, as political scientists, we rely on shortcuts, political cues and shortcuts, because a lot of voters, we have a myriad of issues that Errol just laid out that we're going to the polls. So you don't need to know every exact issue. It's just, what's the shortcut? What's essentially the headline for me when I go to the polls? And so, you know, yes, it's my job as a New Yorker, as someone who cares about this nation and cares about the future of our democracy, to articulate what the stakes are.
Right.
But it is also incumbent upon the administration and the DNC to have a local strategy.
Right.
We saw this in Long Island with Tom Suozzi when he says,
Exactly.
President Biden, you can stay in DC. I've got to handle this race. And like, it's a little more complicated than a larger Democratic strategy. We need to sort of think about local politics and meet people where they are, because some communities don't really care about infrastructure. Other communities, it is the main
everything.
issue,
It's
and we
everything.
need to have all the surrogates. Pete
Right.
Buttigieg has been a great surrogate on Republican networks to just break down some of the misinformation and disinformation.
Can I, if I could just add, because it's an extraordinarily important point that she raises, that if you think about those political cues, why do Republicans go back to crime and immigration and migrant crisis, right? Are they really dealing with that in Oyster Bay? Not necessarily, but it is a proxy for urban problems,
Right.
not wanting to seep into the suburbs, right?
Right.
It's all of these issues are racialized and urbanized, and they don't need to necessarily spell that out. A lot of their voters feel that emotionally, and I think that's the kind of connection that Democrats have always struggled to make,
Right.
that emotional connection. So when you talk about the connection between infrastructure and union apprenticeships, jobs, can I support my family? That's where we sort of need to do better in the language and the connectivity.
So let's tackle some issues, you know, and as I told you all, that what I think the issue is the Supreme Court that we have in the United States right now. The most remarkable moment, I thought, of President Biden's State of the Union address is when he leaned over that podium and pointed to the Supreme Court justices. I mean, I got the sense that he was threatening them. Maybe he was just warning them, you know, you guys are wrong. And the looks on their faces was, you know, just worth it all for the what I perceive to be the destruction that they are laying on America. So, you know, talk to us about the Supreme Court and what we do about that, Christina.
Well, it should be noted that Clarence Thomas chose not to attend, so he was not one of the people
He was
who
not
was
one being threatened.
Exactly. You know, we always wonder, you know, will a party overplay their hand? Will the Supreme Court overplay their hand? I mean, we know that when abortion is on the ballot, Republicans lose. By and large, this country believes in a woman's right to choose. And it should be framed as thus. So we should stop using the term pro-life, because Republicans believe in the death penalty, they believe in starving children at the border, they believe in starving children in America. So like, we should stop using Republican talking points when we're talking about a constitutional issue of a woman's right to choose or not. So that's just laying the groundwork. Democrats have always sort of ceded the courts to Republicans in sort of recent eras. And it's just, it hasn't been a sexy issue. It hasn't been something that Democrats are really concerned about, because we thought certain big ticket items were asked and answered. Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Immigration Act, Housing Act, Roe v. Wade. Those were sort of settled and we can move on. And we've seen a Republican strategy erode that over the past 50 plus years. And so now it's a wake up moment. We also saw we have to link the Obama administration to the Biden administration. Obama had several hundreds of judges that he just could not sit because the Republican Senate wouldn't allow him to. He had a Supreme Court justice that they wouldn't allow him to nominate. So we were in this holding pattern, and then we see Donald Trump filling in lower level courts, filling in Supreme Court justices, and now we have essentially a 6-3 court that we're trying to figure out, what do we do with these people, some of whom feel like they work for Donald Trump, which is the antithesis of what the framers intended, be it imperfect men that they were. So now we have this 6-3 court, which is looking like it'll be that way for quite some time. They're young, relatively healthy, it seems.
Life tenure.
Right. So now with the separation of powers and checks and balances, we're going to have to figure out sort of different routes and maybe codify certain issues that have been in the legal world. We need to make them in the legislative world. And that's going to be a little complicated depending on if we have unified government, one party in power, or divided government, because we've seen it's not just gridlock, it's sort of a stalemate nowadays because the two political parties, as George Washington warned us about in his farewell address, are so calcified and opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. I was so surprised that former Justice Breyer actually called, the sitting justices to task, saying, "What are you all doing? Are you?" And he actually framed it, "Are you actually going to let a woman die on the table?" And the answer would seem to be yes. That they actually are, which I thought it was so great that Vice President Harris actually turned up at Planned Parenthood, the first time ever that a president or a vice president has made that move to say, look, folks, this has got to change.
That's right. The Supreme Court, and it was a stunning moment and an unfortunate one, in my opinion, when at the State of the Union address, everyone, or many people, stood up and were cheering/jeering at the Supreme Court justices who, true to their profession, really couldn't react and just kind of sat there like statues. I think that there is a problem, though. There is obviously an underlying problem, that they are the product of minority rule. At least one seat was stolen from a president during the Obama administration. That's not acceptable by any means. There was this 50-year long march where the Federalist Society and conservative activists specifically and strategically, set their sights on taking over the court and changing specific rulings. Politics is the way it's played. That's the way it's played. Democrats will have to sort of figure out if they want to play on that turf, and if so, they need their own 50-year plan. But where we are now, I think, is very much like what the president said, that got that reaction at the State of the Union, which is that they have awakened a sleeping giant. That women are not going to, suburban women, conservative women, women of across the board politically have signaled in race after race after race, from conservative Kansas to, liberal California, they are not going to simply sit back and watch this happen. And so, ultimately, it may take longer than we would like. There will be a lot of pain and problems along the way. But if the majority wants something, even a highly politicized Supreme Court that was tilted by means that were overtly political cannot suppress people's desire to have the things that the last half century brought this country. And that includes voting rights, by the way.
But Basil, is there any way of that happening November 5th? Do we really still think the reproductive rights are at a certain point, the number one issue in the country, and that women are going to, or could?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's interesting because when you think about and there's a point I want to make in a second about what's happening in the States, but if you look at the controversial rulings, particularly in Alabama, right? The IVF, ruling, what's interesting to me, just from a strategic point of view, Donald Trump is shrinking his base of support, not expanding it. That's what you're supposed to do when you run for office. You got to expand beyond where you are. What he does is double down. And I think what a lot of conservatives have done is double down. Whereas the issue of reproductive rights has expanded the base of opportunity for Democrats. And actually, in my view, has reshaped, even if it's just for this election, the Democratic coalition that we sort of used to know over the last 10 to 15 years. But just very quickly, there's evidence that, well, not evidence, but there's history with respect to how Biden talked to the Supreme Court, because Barack Obama did the same thing. I think it was over the case of Citizens United.
Right.
And he challenged them in the State of the Union. That in and of itself was not a motivating issue in the way that reproductive rights is. But what it does signal is that when you layer what the conservatives have done with the judiciary over the last 20 or so years, add to that Democrats lost 1,000 state legislative seats during the Obama era. When you see how issues like reproductive rights are then pushed to the states, this is part of the grand plan. So that if you're in a state and you go to the courts, if it's going to be decided by a conservative or not in that state, it will hit a conservative justice at some point, including all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what I think has happened, to Christina's point earlier, it's not sexy, but the strategy in terms of how you shape state legislatures and how you shape judiciaries is really important to make sure that a lot of these policies actually stick and have teeth.
Well, and can I just add to that?
Sure.
Because this is what I try and explain to my students all the time. We always talk about the top of the ticket, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Right.
But both Errol and Basil have said, it's all the races down below, because we know city council members tend to become people who run for the state house at some point, because there are only a limited number of offices sort of in this country. People who are in your state legislatures oftentimes run for Congress,
Right.
for the House. And then those members of the House oftentimes run for Senate. They're the ones who actually confirm Supreme Court justices. So we need to be paying attention on some of the lowest levels of local politics, because problematic people tend to get in and they can stay in. I mean,
Right.
lots of people looked up and they were like, Josh Hawley, like, where did he come from?
Right.
You know, or whomever it may be. And so when we think about the trajectory of how we get Supreme Court justices, an issue that is of great concern to you and millions of others, it's because these people started in local level office.
The PTA, right.
I mean, we're seeing people, you know, I always joke about Jersey and, like, you know, all the different offices they have. You know,
Right.
it's like the head of the water commission is one of the most important people, right? As someone
Right.
who's head of a water commission should be. And so I think when we're looking at a full ticket and a party, you may not be in love with who's at the top, but think about what that party does for your life or against your life and those who you love.
Just a quick reaction, a final question about the Supreme Court. Total immunity for presidents and ex-presidents is before the court and will have an effect on this election. All of the court cases for Donald Trump have been delayed. So we're looking at a Supreme Court now built by Donald Trump, some would say having to vote on whether or not he gets immunity for life for whatever he does beyond the presidency. How's that going to play out?
Well, I don't think the Supreme Court will give him that, because I think it's about accountability for past and future presidents, quite frankly. So I don't, but I will say something about this process, and it's very important for, I think, black voters. Donald Trump was at a podium at a rally saying, black voters should support me because I'm being prosecuted and persecuted in a way that African Americans can relate to in the courts.
Yeah, indicted, he said.
It's absolutely ridiculous.
Right.
But even in this process, you see how the system is so unfair, because who has the money and the resources to be able to take their issues and the many that he has through the courts in the way that he has, all the way up to the Supreme Court? That dichotomy for the average voter, but certainly for black voters, is very plain to see. which makes his remarks so incredibly hypocritical and actually quite racist. But
that and the sneakers,
and the sneakers, right.
I think on the total immunity claim is preposterous. I think it's a delay tactic.
Yeah.
And delay, by the way, is an acceptable legal tactic.
But the court took it up, you know.
Well,
everybody would say, of course it's ridiculous, and yet they're going to spend their time.
I would expect that they will, again, take longer than any of us would like. But I believe on that particular question, they're going to come back with the right answer, because there is no scenario, there's no reading of the Constitution, there's no reading of case law or practical concerns that could lead you to the idea that a president can, and the hypothetical was actually put before the court, assassinate a rival and be immune from liability unless he's impeached.
Yes,
that is preposterous.
But why, Christina? Why did they say, yes, we'll consider it?
Well, you know, my concern, and Errol is the legal scholar, my concern is we'll have a Bush v. Gore scenario where, you know, I'm always interested in not just the vote, but the opinion, where they might vote a particular way, but then the opinion says something where I'm left scratching my head.
Right.
Donald Trump is still an American citizen, and so if we're going to have this in front of the Supreme Court, he should not have a sort of select status as a former president. And this actually isn't just about Donald Trump. It is about future presidents and the future of this nation. What I do worry about, though, is that Donald Trump is setting up a scenario so that if he does not win, he's already said, well, it's either because it's stolen, the court stole it, the people stole it, the voters stole it, the other party stole it, my own party stole it from me. And so he's been sort of sowing these violent seeds for quite some time amongst his supporters. That is also of great concern.
Well, fortunately, we have part 2 of this discussion that will take place shortly. But we need to stop now, and we'll pick up for part 2. But I want to thank Dr. Christina Greer, Errol Lewis, and Dr. Basil Smikle for this bracing beginning conversation. And you will be able to catch the second half of this conversation, where we're going to go more local, exploring the Senate, the House races, and so much more. So that's it for us for this moment. Stay tuned for part 2. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm Carol Jenkins. The program is Black America. We'll see you the next time.